Hi, I'm Jack Jose. I'm the president of the board of Ohio Students for Gun Legislation, a registered 501c4 political advocacy group. Welcome to our podcast, where we talk with experts working to prevent gun violence, and we share advice, strategies, legislative ideas, and we offer steps you can take to reduce the devastating toll that guns take on American lives every year. We're speaking today with Brian Garry, and here to introduce our guest is Ohio Students for Gun Legislation founder and executive director, Ethan Nichols.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank you all for tuning in and watching and listening today. Today, we are speaking with Brian Garry. Brian ran for city council back in 2017 and other races, and he's been a fearless advocate for the community and for the underrepresented in Cincinnati. Brian has worked to address poverty, economic issues, racial disparities, and gun violence in his own communities. And we're excited to speak with you today. Brian, would you mind briefly kind of introducing yourself, your background, anything else we didn't hit on? Yeah.
Well, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on, Ethan and Jack. I'm honored to be on, especially with such an important issue, a life and death issue that, you know, really saves lives when you think about the, close to 100,000 people that are killed per year. That's accurate number, right? Around 90,000, isn't it, through gun violence?
In that neighborhood.
Yeah, in that neighborhood. And the, obviously they're killed in a variety of ways. I've personally seen a couple people murdered and watched them take their last breath. And it's traumatizing on an individual basis. It's also motivating on a policy or legislative basis to try to see that kind of thing doesn't happen again. I was born and raised in Bond Hill, not far from where I'm sitting, and it was I had a kind of a rough childhood, and I saw a lot of things that really shaped and formed who I am today. So your average person in life, they're not raised as a minority in their own community. So our communities are so segregated that most people are raised either in a black neighborhood or a white neighborhood. I was fortunate, really, to be raised in Bond Hill, and I just saw so many things.
Oh wait, I think Brian just
Hating who I am. So from environmental pollution, we had 5 chemical companies within a mile of my house, to racial injustices that happened. I know when there was a situation and my mom called the police, when they came 5 hours later, my mom complained, that they, because the police station's only a mile from there. And when she complained, they said, "Lady, what do you expect living in a neighborhood like this?" And she said, "I expect, effective and prompt police service." So there was, so many things from my childhood and my youth that formed who I am. Last thing I'll say is on development issues. My mom, there was a big development coming to our street. In fact, when I was 3 months old, and my mom organized against it on the streets of Bond Hill. She put me on her hip, and we went around and, taking out round flyers and everything like that. And, she won the issue. And then she became the president of the Bond Hill Community Council, along with an African-American man named Reverend Russo O'Neill. So they were co-presidents. And I just think that that's the world that I want to live in. The way that we need to live is united, black and white in one struggle for economic justice and racial justice and gun sense safety for everyone.
Thank you, Brian, so much for coming on. I should say, I really think that your background and your experience is something that we don't often see a lot among organizers, activists, candidates, at any level of government, people who have a direct background that influences how they think about policy like this. So I want to ask you,
probably have a similar background to you, Ethan.
Yeah, Yeah, living up and growing up in Avondale, yeah. So I want to ask you, so every year, 40,000 Americans are shot and killed as a result of gun violence in some way, whether that be suicide, a domestic violence situation, a murder, a homicide, a mass shooting. However, there's so many aspects of gun violence. But what is one legislative policy solution that if you could snap your fingers and choose one piece of policy or legislation that would directly impact gun violence, what would that policy issue be?
I know this is going to sound weird. Jack and I, we've worked together on a gun violence plan, and the 6 categories of this plan are health, which includes mental health, education, economics. There's a category called spiritual, social, and cultural, a youth and family support, and then there's one category called law enforcement. So of the 6 categories, only one of them actually sort of directly relates to guns. So even though there's sort of two lines of issues that relate to gun violence, because there's really 2 kinds of gun violence. I think that people are really very concerned about these days. One, of course, is the mass shootings that have occurred on a very, have been occurring on a higher frequency throughout our city, throughout our country. We did have an attempted mass shooting here in Cincinnati at the Fifth Third Bank on Fountain Square. So it has affected us here directly. And, in that particular case, law enforcement stopped the individual very quickly. What was a tragic and horrible situation, but it could have been much, much worse given the amount of ammunition that he had with him and the number of guns that he had with him. So the reason I'm giving all this background or prefacing what I'm going to say is that, in that time, we're very, very concerned about certain types of guns that shouldn't be on the street. We're very concerned about the prevalence of guns. Sorry, there's a helicopter going by. About the prevalence of guns that are on our street, and all of this interrelates. But if there was one piece of legislation that I think would be most effective, these are 2 different streams of thought. They're concurrent streams of thought side by side. Obviously, we want to deal with gun safety legislation and banning assault rifles. But the other stream of consciousness is about the number of people, which in our city, in Cincinnati, is a much larger number, that deals with street violence. So in the, if we just said the last 5 years or something like that here in Cincinnati, the number of occurrences of mass gun violence, I think that we had a shooting at a nightclub that included, I think, about 17 individuals. And then we had the Fifth Third situation, which included several individuals as well. When we look at situations like Cameron Franklin, who was killed in Lower Price Hill, it's been a year. The perpetrator has not been caught. He was shot in the head 3 times. In addition to Cameron, there's, in the vicinity of 70 people, per year killed. So in 5 years, we're looking at like 350 people. So I think we have to look at both of these. And I think in terms of the street violence, the legislation that would help solve that would be economic legislation, would be a taxation type of legislation, which would create a fund to help, in essence, bring about economic equality, which is very closely tied to racial equality. And so, in essence, I'm saying taxation, taxing a graduated tax rate on both state, county, as well as municipal, which would create a fund which would help to end poverty. That would be the first and foremost legislation. And then the second most important would be, ending the gun loopholes, creating red flag laws, having a 2-week waiting period, these types of gun safety. It's just so basic, very, very basic laws that would save so many lives, both with street violence, with suicides, and with the mass shootings.
And that's one of the things I know, Brian, you've been really consistent on is not never talking about gun control. Like, even though I met you through work related to preventing gun violence and your passionate advocacy for Cameron and his family, and others who've been the victims of gun violence, the message has never been guns are bad, ban guns, take guns. That your message always is, look, there's a larger economic puzzle that we need to put the pieces together. And because the people who are using the guns often are using them because they have some other deficit someplace else that could be bolstered if their parents had productive jobs with incomes that could pay for standard housing, and then it shores up everything and the violence dissipates. And I think that's such a strong position, and such a sort of a bigger view than certainly the way that some gun activists get pigeonholed by political opponents as gun grabbers.
Yeah. I mean, we did go we did go straight to Senator Portman's home, right after the Dayton shooting, and we did demand, some very basic, the things that we just talked about, which are very basic. I mean, you can't get much more basic, than a red flag law, or closing some of the loopholes. I mean, we're not asking, or I'm not, saying, take all the hundreds of millions of guns.
Hang on, Brian. I think you hit your mute button. There you go.
Sorry about that. Can you still hear me?
Uh-huh.
You can hear me, right?
Faintly.
Something happened. Sorry.
Get my own over there. She'll fix it.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Just try.
There you go.
You're back.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't know what happened there. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just saying that we went to Senator Portman's home, and we were, a very vocal group, and, just asking him to do very basic things like red flag laws and, the 2-week waiting period and closing the loopholes. I mean, those are 3 such very fundamental, very simple, low-hanging fruit, as it were, that could be enacted, by our federal government.
And, the governor came out. We actually issued a statement supporting the governor's statement immediately after the Dayton shooting. He issued some, what was it, Ethan, like some 13 different steps that he was interested in taking that seemed like they'd be helpful, and or more than that. And then he was, when it came time to sort of push it in the legislature, he sort of threw up his hands and said, well, gosh, this is the best. What are you going to do? A bunch of Republicans in the Ohio Senate and Ohio Congress, and I did what I could. So we issued some proclamations and didn't make any change.
Right. Which is what's. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, which is what politicians so often do. Locally, all of them. I mean, they're afraid of the NRA. They're afraid of the lobbyists, and I can't live like that. I can't live in fear. I can't make my decisions on fear. I have to make my decisions based on principle. You just can't worry about the future, and you have to do what's right, not what's politically expedient.
Right.
And Brian, I want to follow up briefly. As a former candidate for city council, I was wondering what do you see city council being able to do to directly address local gun violence here within the city of Cincinnati?
Well, thanks, Ethan. Yeah, so some of the things I was talking about. So we haven't released our recommendations yet, but just in a nutshell, Cincinnati is like the sixth most segregated city and the second or first in the country for childhood poverty. And they build prisons. You probably heard this. They build prisons based upon the location of the prison is determined through the 4th grade reading level of the children in the area. So they know, as an example, if a child isn't able to read, when they're in the 4th grade, and they have a number of people who are, in this category, they know that those kids are going to be going to prison. I mean, you can pretty much determine, from the atmosphere that a child grows up in. Is he economically supported? Is he exposed to violence? Is he exposed to trauma? Are his basic needs met? You can pretty much tell who's going to be going to prison. It's really sad. It's really, really a sad indictment on our society about who we relegate, to living on the streets, or who we relegate to living a life of crime, so to speak, because it's very, very clear that the people who are in prison, the people who are engaging in gun violence, are people who are in poverty. I mean, it's at least on the gun violence that occurs on our streets. Okay, the city, the urban gun violence, which is a whole different category than the suicides and the gun violence that occurs in the terms of mass shootings. Okay, like those really have to be looked at very differently.
Mm-hmm.
I think, mental health, one of our categories is mental health, and that would really play a huge role with mass shootings. And we need to have more mental health available. We need to have mental health in our schools. Jack's a former principal, and he knows that we are not, as a city, we do not support our schools as well as we should in terms of health care and mental health, with the school nursing program, which is not as prevalent or well funded as it should be. And then we have mental health, which a lot of places they do have counselors, but then they have like one counselor for 700 kids, or maybe even 2 counselors. But we could actually have a pedagogy of mental health. What we can actually do in the classroom. I know Jack is concerned that we always put too much on the education system in terms of teaching. They can't do everything, and I agree with that. But we can also, as a city, we can fund more mental health. And what I mean by mental health is not simply addressing issues when they arise, but actually creating health as opposed to mental illness, not just simply addressing mental illness, but creating mental health. What does it take for a person to be mentally healthy? And using our city resources to create that and partnering with our schools. That would be, for the mass gun violence, for the shootings that are occurring on our streets, which are, daily. I mean, several shootings every single day. Those really have to be addressed on an economic level, because it's very clear that in my 55 years of living here in Cincinnati, I'm not saying every single shooting, but I'll say damn near every single shooting. I haven't heard of a single street violence, gun violence issue occurring in Indian Hill. I haven't heard of a single gun violence issue occurring in Hyde Park. The gun violence that occurs in poor neighborhoods, and it occurs at the perpetrator and the victims are poor. The two murders that I personally witnessed, the first set of individuals, the perpetrator and the victim, were both 19 years old. They were both dropouts from Woodward High School. They both had children under the age of 3 months. They were both raised and living in poverty, and the one of them had HIV. So, you know, you're looking at a cultural or a socioeconomic you know, condition that is a breeding ground for gun violence.
I want to thank you so much for coming on and joining us today, Brian. Unfortunately, it looks like we're about out of time.
Sorry about
that. Thank you so much for all of your advocacy and your organizing around these important issues. And especially I want to point out your work addressing the root causes of gun violence. And I want to thank you so much for drawing attention to these important issues. So thank you so much for coming on and joining us today.
Thank you, Ethan. I hope I answered your questions well.
Absolutely.
I apologize if I ramble on too much.
No. Your passion and your advocacy are why you're here. And we want to showcase that to other people. If you're interested in reducing gun violence in Ohio, join Ohio Students for Gun Legislation. Go to our website, studentsforgunlegislation.org. From there, you can join. You can get some resources to organize an event. You can get direct teaching from Ethan Nichols on how to organize an event. You can buy merchandise. You can make a donation to help students identify, address, and solve the specific issues surrounding gun violence in Ohio. Your donation will go directly to student organizers and help them get involved in their communities to make a difference and reduce gun violence in the state of Ohio. Thank you again so much, Brian.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you, Ethan, for your incredible work that you've been doing for so long. You're an amazing young man, and I just can't wait to see where your trajectory takes you from here. I just really appreciate everything I see you do. It's heartwarming to see you doing all the things you're doing and the caring compassion that you bring to the fight to end gun violence.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate your advocacy equally.